So today's talk actually stems in part from research that I conducted for my dissertation and also from an event which I just recently spoke at in India. It's entitled Dimensionality and Chinese Views on India and Space. And just to give you a brief overview, these are two charts that came out of my dissertation. And what I was really looking at initially and trying to determine is in what ways have Chinese views towards India changed over time. And I conducted the same actual research on Indian views on China, but today I'll be focusing just on China. And one of the things that I found that was particularly interesting is despite all of the dismissiveness that you still hear from the Chinese side towards India, there is definitely a marked rise in attention paid towards India. Now, this line is not one I doctored up. This is actually a trend line that when you put in the digits appears. And what we see here in particular are two dates during which there was a marked rise. One is in 2000 and the other is in 2005. Now, this is just from a quantitative standpoint. From a qualitative standpoint, what we find out is an increased attention to Clinton's visit to India in 2000, which was actually the first visit of a U.S. president, sitting U.S. president, since Jimmy Carter. And what we also see is 2005, and there was marked attention paid to the U.S.-India nuclear deal, and also space cooperation as it was being discussed between the United States and India. So those are particularly noteworthy. The bottom graph, which I apologize for not having translated out of Chinese, actually just also indicates that there was a rise in the number of images and other things within these journals, but not a rise in the level of contents. So what we see here is that there was more discussion of India, most definitely occurring within China. Just to give you, I'm not going to go through all these, but these are the sources that I used for that to back up that information. Now, in terms of overall shift in gaze, I found there to be 5 trends which were particularly noteworthy on the Chinese side. There were definitely more numerous and lengthy articles on India's military modernization. There's increasing dehyphenation of Pakistan and India, so basically treating them as distinct entities in these articles. More in-depth analysis of Indian military equipment and systems, comparison of Chinese and Indian developments and the implications for China. And this is particularly important to note because in the past, most of these articles tended to be very rote. They would just list, say, what their ballistic missile capabilities were without ever really talking about what the implications were for China or for satellites and what have you. And finally, inclusion of India in articles devoted to China's own military modernization. You will find articles that focus, per se, on China's 60 years of its PLA. And at the same time, they will mention India's aircraft carriers. They will mention India's advances in other regions. And that is definitely a new trend. Now, in terms of aerospace, this is only through 2009 to start, but I do have statistics near the end which will cover 2010 as well. And really where I focused most of my attention when I went back and did my review and focused on aerospace was on 3 particular journals. One is International Aviation, one is Missiles and Space Vehicles, and the other is Aerospace China. And these are Chinese journals, all in Chinese. The thing that particularly stood out to me, what we see here, is there is a focus on aviation, but it's much lesser than what you find with the aerospace field. And what really stood out to me even more so than this, even though it doesn't occupy a large amount, is we see these yellow lines. These yellow lines come from a strictly scientific journal. These are journals in which you see formulas. You don't really see that much of geopolitical trends. And I think the fact that they're mentioning India in these journals is extremely significant because this is not something you saw in the past. And what's particularly interesting also is this occurred as far back as 1993. So it's a very early trend. It's not necessarily a new one. And in addition to this, in addition to the fact that the scientific community is paying such attention, when we look at the countries that this is a breakdown of the countries referred to in the scientific journals. What we see is, of course, we would expect there to be a focus on the United States and Russia that would predominate within China. But it's not just these 2 countries anymore. Once again, we see these yellow lines as far back as 1993, and it's quite significant, actually. And I think this, once again, points to the fact that the scientific community within China has been paying a long and sustained attention to Indian aerospace advances. Now, in terms of what kinds of systems and things that they're talking about, I think what really stood out to me is, of course, I included ballistic missiles in this range because they're looking at these at the same time in these aerospace journals, not just space itself. And what we find is we do find a focus on the strategic journals on things like the Prithvi, the Agni, this idea of an intercontinental ballistic missile with the Surya. But once again, where I found the most attention being paid to, say, satellite systems, launch vehicles, and otherwise was still within the scientific community. And I apologize if it's a little bit cut off on the top, but it's the yellow community that I found the most in-depth articles being written about India. And what's interesting, too, I think, is if you look at the academic journals, the paucity of information about systems relative to the other two. However, this shifts when we talk about themes. And I think in this one, it's important to look at how the numbers have basically filtered out towards the edges. What we do see, particularly in both the strategic and scientific side, is this focus on the idea of a strategic nuclear triad. And the nuclear triad is something that comes up again and again in all of these. And I think that when we look at this in terms of space, it's particularly important in terms of the fact that India is now looking for its nuclear submarine program. It's also talking about deploying a naval satellite. This is going to be backing up their nuclear submarine program as well. So it's something that not only appears again and again in the textual research I found, but when I attended a conference most recently in New Delhi, it's something that came up again as well. We also see the attention to missile defense, and this is multi-tiered. This is two-tiered missile defense, also comes up to an increasing degree. But within themes, what really stood out to me, I think not only in the academic venue, but throughout, is this idea of a great power dream. Now, I couldn't fit dream on here, but great power dream is a dago, a monk. It's something that is referred to quite frequently in terms of India, and it's a dismissive term. This idea that to be a great power, you need certain types of capabilities. And among these capabilities, of course, is our capabilities in space. What it is also quite often paired with is this idea of the China threat. You hear this quite frequently or you see this quite frequently in the journals and also in conversation. And they usually put these in quotation marks. Whenever you're reading Chinese, I think, and you see either something in quotation marks or with 所谓, so-called, in front of it, then it's usually a dismissive way of looking at whatever capabilities they see the other having. So once again, it is somewhat dismissive. However, the fact that they're even paying attention to these capabilities, I think, indicates a degree of importance conveyed to the Indian side. What you also see, and this was particularly fascinating to me, because I'm also looking at, obviously, how India sees China, is this idea of Indo-US strategic encirclement, expansionism and hegemony, nationalism and militarism. This is how the Chinese are looking at the Indians. It's also how the Indians, of course, look at the Chinese. So you see a lot of mirroring going on. They're using a lot of the same terminology to refer to one another. However, at the same time, too, one thing that I think stands out as a difference is this idea of looking at stability and cooperation. You see it there with 13 mentions, but actually, in my interviews, I found that stability and cooperation were mentioned to a much greater extent by the Chinese side than by the Indian side. And I'll get to that in a little bit, what that means. Once again, I just wanted to put up my sources for these. This is where it came from. And you can see here with the discussions that I conducted, they were with scholars at the Academy of Military Sciences, Beihang University, which is a premier aerospace university, National Defense University, PLA, and PLAN, China Atomic Energy Institute. So we have a number of nuclear scientists as well. And what was striking to me is that they all, by and large, mentioned the things that I just mentioned. Now, in terms of updating my findings, this is what I actually conducted just prior to research, which I conducted just prior to this conference I just attended. Now, I essentially went into the Tsinghua University database and entered the two terms Hantian and Yindu, so basically aerospace and India, to see how many hits I got. I got well into, actually there were thousands of hits, but when I really narrowed it down, it was only about 400 or so, but that's still a significant count. And what we see here, we see this, once again, we see this rise, this trend line rising up. But what is particularly interesting to me is, once again, it's in the scientific realm. There are scientific journals that most of the discussion of China's aerospace, or India's aerospace, are coming from, much more so than from the strategic community. And when you look at what is being discussed within these articles, when you look at the number of times missiles are mentioned, for example, these are the green lines for those. Very, very actually limited mention. And once again, we see it more of a focus on space, launch vehicles, fairly what you might call, it's certainly dual-use technology, but I think that what stood out to me is the fact that they aren't really looking at this from a strategic lens as of yet. It's still very operational. Now, in terms of topic range, I think this also bears this point out. You see analysis of service performance of Indian regional navigation satellite systems, metal matrix composites on aerospace. Agni, you do see some strategic issues, Agni ballistic missile penetration and performance, but that's certainly to be expected. I would be surprised if they weren't looking at these issues. And by the way, these are all these journals are actually all scientific journals. What you also see, and this is interesting to me, is an increasing number, I would say from 2008, talking about India's ASAT capabilities. India pushing forward in ballistic missile defense. There is awareness of India's interest in these, and I was actually really taken aback by this conference I just went to in New Delhi. The extent to which the Indian scholars and strategic community and a number of people who work in the Ministry of Defense were talking about ASAT. So this is something that they're definitely looking at, and they're looking at it vis-a-vis China and China's test in 2007. But still, largely, talking about remote sensing, cryogenic engines, launcher and missile tests and failures, microsatellites, nothing that shocking. And once again, we come to the point of cooperation. Because I think, I put up Boeing and ISRO here, because I think this is particularly important, because obviously since Obama's last visit to India, he made the announcement that the United States would be removing 3 entities from the entity list. One of these was ISRO, which is the Indian Space Research Organization, the other being DRDO, which of course works on defense contracts for the country, and the third is Bharat Dynamics Limited, which is most focused on missile defense. So these are 3 major organizations that were just removed from the entity list for the US. So in terms of outward perceptions, I have both outward and inward. Outward is basically, in my dissertation, the idea is you have to put some theory in. I'm not a big fan of theory. Obviously, you can see I have a lot of quantitative statistics here. But what I think really stood out to me is how so often the way in which the Chinese scholars were referring to India, I think falls into 4 large categories that come from social psychology. The first of these is relative deprivation. It's exactly what it sounds like. Vis-a-vis another country, another actor, you feel deprived. You don't feel that you receive the same level of treatment. And this comes up again and again. And it's not just about this new level of cooperation. It's about old programs. It's about this idea of the BrahMos missile cooperation between Russia and India. It's about space cooperation with the United States, this entity list issue that I just mentioned. And it's about missile defense. In terms of expressed versus hidden attitudes, what was striking to me when I was interviewing scholars within China is the level to which they would say in our conversations that all missile defense was focused on Pakistan. And yet there were so many writings as of late, I would say in the past 2 to 3 years, that have been talking about multi-tiered missile defense and how it impacts China. So there is definitely a disjunction between what they're saying and what you see appearing within these writings. Another thing that comes up again and again is overconfidence phenomenon. And this is usually paired actually with victim mentality. Now when you look at India and China, the thing that stands out the most is the 1962 border conflict, of course. And China as the victor in this particular conflict, I think it's not hard to see exactly who is probably more guilty of overconfidence phenomenon. But great power dream, as I mentioned earlier, points to this. A number of people that I interviewed and in a number of the pieces that I saw, they really questioned why India would pursue, say, an ASAT test. They thought, why does India need an ASAT? It was somewhat of a dismissive attitude, and often, actually, in this number of cases, referred to India as a petulant child seeking attention. And so I think that feeds into this overconfidence phenomenon. And I noticed when I was in India, really riled up the crowd of scholars that were there, and came up again and again. In fact, we had one scholar who was from Cornell University who works on space debris issues and on missile defense. He's a Chinese scholar. And he expressed to me extreme surprise that there was so much vituperation about China. So much anger and mistrust directed at China. Most people are just scientists, they're working on their own field, they're not aware of this at all, the geopolitics, politics of it all. In terms of instrumental aggression, this is often paired with hostile aggression. It doesn't necessarily have to be an action, it can also be a perspective. And I find that because it's still the scientific community within China that's focused on India's space program, I think that most of this qualifies as instrumental aggression or instrumental lens. So when you see them refer to C4ISR, remote sensing, which of course can be used for military capabilities, and even ASAT, it still tends to be more of a curiosity. It's not really this charged vocabulary that you might see coming out of India when they're looking at China. And also, I just wanted to point out the fact that despite the fact that they're removed from all of this, when you look at this chart here, you see the number of times they're referring to China in addition to their discussion of India. That pairing of China and India is definitely on the rise. So my own take on this is that they are moving from say, an instrumental lens focused on the scientific aspect of this towards the strategic. And that's something we need to keep in mind, especially if India does go ahead and decide to pursue an ASAT program. Now, inward perceptions. At this conference, I was asked numerous times about the ASAT issue and how it was perceived within China. And so, in large part, while I was in India, I found that the Chinese program was being used as justification as why India needs one. So I thought it important to talk about inward perceptions as well. What we see within China, and I welcome anyone who has more data on this to challenge this, but really I find that it's still referred to, once again, in a scientific light. China's 2007 test is still referred to as a Weixing Shiyan. It's still referred to in terms of just a satellite experiment, not an ASAT. They would never use that terminology. I still find that most scholars do not. There were a few military generals at some of the events that I went to who challenged this, said, we should call it what it is. But for the most part, in the official rhetoric about the ASAT, it's not called an ASAT. And it's also referred to in political terms, bringing the United States back to the negotiating table at the Composite Disarmament. This idea that, well, if the United States won't negotiate with us on Paros and all these other things that we're interested in talking about, then we need to have a show, just like we did with, say, the nuclear side. You possess the capabilities, and then it forces your counterpart to negotiate with you. Once again, this, as I mentioned before, there's a surprise by the strong negative reaction towards China. They point to longer-standing U.S. and Russian programs. They feel that largely, the people that I surveyed and also the journals, that they're taking a reactive stance, being pushed down a path, beidong. So in terms of feeling that the other is basically forcing you into this position of having to develop these capabilities, much like with the rhetoric you see surrounding their nuclear program. And there's not the same level of adulation as over the Shenzhou capabilities and over their achievements. It's largely lacking in the general discussion within China, which is why I had to base much of this on my interviews and in the very few sources that I was able to find within the press and academic journals. Now, what does this mean for practice and future? This is my last slide. Really, I think from the side of interaction, what I was really struck by when I was speaking with a lot of the scientists in both countries is the lack of interaction. Now, I mentioned this conference that I just went to in New Delhi. There was a scientist, Bharat Gopalswamy, who is actually at CIPRI. He was at this, and he and another scholar who's also at Cornell, who's named Wang Ting, they had just conducted a project on space debris. So you see this occasional interaction, but of course you realize that both of these scholars are doing this within the West. They're already at say, a U.S. institution conducting this research. It's still, by and large, very rare. And one of the things that came out of my own research for my dissertation is what I call the strategist, scientist, scholar divergence. I divided things into three categories, three groups within China and in India. And what I find is, or what I have found is, since I began my research into China and India, which actually began quite a while ago, but actually was here at CNS. I did quite a bit on that in the past. And what I found is that most of these conferences I've attended over the past few years, is you find more strategists coming in from the Indian side and more academics coming in from the Chinese side to engage in discussions. So there tends to be a disjunction. You have all these retired military officers from the Indian side who, of course, are going to take a much more charged view of what's going on within China. And from the Chinese side, they tend to be academics, stressing this idea of cooperation between the two. So there's a definite mismatch, I would say, between the two. Another issue that I have run into in the past, and most recently, quite personally, is in trying to get visas. I had trouble getting a visa within China to go to India for this conference. Any number of my Chinese colleagues have had trouble getting visas to go to India. It's actually a huge problem. And it's not just the scientific community, it's across the boards. So my contention is, how can you talk about cooperation between the two when one side can't even get to the other? And of course, on the Indian side as well, you have the issue of stapled visas and any number of issues over Arunachal Pradesh. And upper level, I would say high level military and also officials that want to travel from these regions to China. However, those are high level people. What I'm talking about within China and the Chinese side are actually lower level young scholars who are very interested in India and want to learn more. So I think that's a major issue that needs to be resolved. In terms of space cooperation, what we see is in 2002 and 2006, there was already discussion of MOUs between the two countries on space cooperation. However, I have seen very little evidence that there's anything concrete coming out of this. But at the same time, what I did find when I spoke with Chinese scholars, experts, military, everything, and scientists, is an interest in these following areas: reduction of space debris, solar power, Moon and Mars exploration, environmental and meteorological surveys. You know, and when I look at the United States and India and how they're cooperating now, you know, we have this high technology working group. My contention is yes, perhaps it's a little too early to discuss this in the India-China context, but we shouldn't rule it out entirely. Most definitely not. Because you look at the areas the United States is now willing to cooperate with China on, which is expanding. I think it is a potentiality for the future. But what do you do in the meantime in order to build up, I would say, the mutual trust level, which is obviously, I would say, from this trip to New Delhi at an all-time low. Joint studies on space power, aerospace strategy, the implications of missile defense, space policy dialogues. What was particularly striking to me, since I tend to work more on the nuclear side of things, is there is a glossary, which you may or may not be aware of, which has come out of nuclear terminology between the United States and China. Now, the fact that there is a glossary in this area, and they worked with the Institute of Mathematics and Applied Physics, and worked also with scientists in the United States to create this nuclear glossary. My contention is it would be useful for the two sides to work together on a glossary for space weaponization, militarization. What do these terms mean? Because as anyone knows who works on space issues, these terms are ill-defined in the international community. Maybe these two countries could actually work together to understand where they both stand on these. And also, I think there are a number of areas that both can cooperate on that don't necessarily mean you have to give up any national security. Codes of conduct, confidence-building measures, whether that just be something as basic as space navigation, notification of space launch, safe traffic management procedures. There's so many areas that I've heard talked about in these meetings, but very rarely has anyone come up with a way of of implementing them. And then finally, where I think this takes us in the future is I think that what really needs to be focused on is the fact that the United States still serves as the centripetal force when we talk about China and India. While there is a rise, as I mentioned, in terms of focus on India within China, a lot of this stems from the fact that actually these are in context of, say, Clinton visiting India, Obama visiting India, or the U.S.-India nuclear deal. The United States is still the driving force. However, that being said, the fact that India is being mentioned, has had mention within these scientific and other journals, completely independent of that. The fact is that if India does pursue an ASAT, continues on with its missile defense programs, these are something that the Chinese side, I think, is looking at to a much greater degree, and it's not a unidirectional focus or gaze, I would say, from the Chinese side. It's also returning. So it's, as I mentioned, it's not unidirectional nor is it one-dimensional. If anything that you take away from this today is that I think one of the big failings I see in a lot of the research regarding China and India as well is there's a tendency to lump everyone together, what Chinese think, what Indians think. The fact is there are a number of interest groups, each of them with a very distinct view of what's going on in the other country. And this is particularly true of the Chinese side. So as we talk about the Chinese scientists and this fact that we're now slowly moving into the strategic realm, the strategic community is starting to become invested in the two countries' cooperation and also the two countries' possible conflict in the future. This is something we need to keep in mind, say, if India does go down the road of an ASAT, how is that going to impact the two? And how can we shape, basically lay the groundwork for the two to avoid this moving from instrumental aggression to hostile aggression? Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.